There are places in this world that time has tried to erase, places where the soil still holds the memory of footsteps that were never free, places where the walls, if they could speak, would tell you stories so heavy, so unbearable, that you would have to sit down and catch your breath before you could go on. Charleston, South Carolina, the heart of the American Deep South. The year is 1852. From the outside, this city is breathtaking. Its pastel-colored row houses line streets paved with cobblestones brought over as ballast in the hulls of ships from Europe. The harbor glitters in the morning sun. Wrought iron balconies overflow with jasmine and bougainvillea. Church spires pierce a sky so blue it almost looks painted. To the visitors who arrived by steamboat from Savannah, Georgia, or by carriage from the tobacco fields of North Carolina, Charleston looked like paradise. But paradise has always had a basement, and in the basement of one particular mansion, on the western edge of the city, where the land begins to soften into marshland and the air carries the thick, green smell of the Ashley River, a furnace burned. It burned in January, it burned in July, it burned at midnight and it burned at noon, and the people forced to stand beside it were not there by choice. This is their story. Stay with us, because what happened inside those walls will change the way you see this country and the people who built it. To understand Colonel Aldous Mercer, you must first understand the world that made him. He was born in 1809 in Columbia, South Carolina. The state capital, a city of red clay roads and white-columned government buildings sitting in the center of a state that had built its entire economy on the bodies of enslaved people. His father was a cotton merchant. His grandfather had been one of the earliest rice planters in the South Carolina Lowcountry, that flat, humid, mosquito-thick stretch of coastline between Charleston and Beaufort, where the tidal rivers flood the fields twice a day, and the labor required to manage those floods was so brutal that plantation owners imported enslaved Africans from the rice-growing regions of Sierra Leone and Senegal, specifically because they already knew how to do it. Aldous Mercer grew up understanding one thing above all else, that wealth in the American South was not built, it was extracted, and the people doing the extraction were considered by law, by culture, and by the sermons preached in Charleston's grandest Episcopal churches to be less than human. By the time he was 42 years old, Colonel Mercer owned one of the most impressive estates in all of Charleston County. 40 acres of land on the western edge of the city. A 3-story mansion with wraparound porches on every floor, tall white columns rising from a foundation of imported Virginia limestone, windows so large they seemed to belong to a cathedral, and a front path lined with ancient live oak trees draped in Spanish moss that swayed in the salt breeze coming off the Atlantic Ocean 18 miles to the east. 61 enslaved men, women, and children lived and worked on that property. They planted and harvested the Sea Island cotton that made Mercer wealthy beyond any reasonable need. They cooked his meals, pressed his shirts, polished his silver, groomed his horses, raised his children, repaired his fences, and built every structure on that land with their own hands, including the basement, including the furnace. The furnace had been installed in 1847, ostensibly for metalwork. Mercer had briefly entertained the idea of an ironworking operation on the property. That idea died within a year, but the furnace remained, and Colonel Mercer, a man of disciplined cruelty, found in it a tool far more useful than iron production. In the South Carolina Lowcountry, summer is not a season. It is a punishment in itself. From June through September, the heat descends on Charleston like a physical weight, thick, wet, suffocating. The humidity rarely drops below 90%. The temperature climbs past 100 degrees by midday. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds over the marshes. The air smells of salt and decay, and something ancient and alive beneath the mud. To be forced to stand beside an open furnace in that heat for 2 hours, 4 hours, 6, was not just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. It was designed to be. Solomon was 16 years old. He had been born on the Mercer estate, in a small wooden cabin at the far end of the property, near the tree line, where the live oaks gave way to the swamp. His mother, a woman named Bess, had named him Solomon because she believed with the fierce and quiet faith of someone who had nothing else that God had given her son wisdom beyond his years. She was right, and that wisdom, in the summer of 1851, was precisely what got him sent to the furnace room. Solomon had, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, quietly and without any display of aggression, refused to strike another enslaved man on Mercer's orders. The other man, older, exhausted, accused of working too slowly, had done nothing wrong. Solomon knew it. Mercer knew it too. But the point was never about justice. The point was about obedience, about breaking the invisible thread of solidarity that connected one enslaved person to another, because that thread, Colonel Mercer understood instinctively, was the only thing that could ever truly threaten him. Solomon was taken to the basement on a Wednesday morning. The temperature outside was 97 degrees. He did not return to the fields. The estate ledger recorded his death on Friday of that same week. Cause listed, fever. Bess was not permitted to hold a funeral. The city of Charleston, South Carolina, went on with its business. Cotton prices were strong that season. The harbor was busy. The society balls on the Battery were the talk of the eastern seaboard. And in the basement of a mansion on the western edge of the city, the furnace continued to burn. Tell us in the comments, do you have relatives or ancestors who lived through the era of American slavery in the Deep South? If so, subscribe to our channel and help us keep this memory alive for the community today. Her name was Nora. She was 34 years old in the summer of 1852, and she had lived on the Mercer estate since she was 7, brought there from a failing plantation outside Beaufort, South Carolina, 40 miles south of Charleston, along the coast of the South Carolina Lowcountry, where the sea islands rise like green jewels from the shallow Atlantic, and the wind smells permanently of salt and sweetgrass. Nora worked as a house servant. She moved through the mansion's grand rooms like a shadow, dusting the mahogany bookshelves in the colonel's study, ironing the Belgian linen tablecloths in the dining room, pouring sweet tea for the ladies who came to call on Eleanor Mercer on Thursday afternoons, when the ceiling fans turned slowly overhead and the conversation floated between recipes and gossip and the careful, deliberate avoidance of anything real. No one in those rooms looked at Nora directly. That was the extraordinary and terrible thing. She was everywhere, always present, and entirely invisible to the people she served. But Nora saw everything. She had been taught to read, carefully, secretly, over the course of 2 winters, by the previous mistress of the house, a woman from Savannah, Georgia, named Mrs. Harriet Colby, who had married into the Mercer family and died of typhoid fever in 1846, taking with her whatever small impulse toward conscience had briefly inhabited those walls. Harriet Colby had pressed a worn King James Bible into Nora's hands 3 days before she died, and Nora had kept it hidden ever since, tucked inside a loose floorboard beneath her sleeping pallet in the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor of the mansion. In the margins of that Bible, and in the hollowed-out spine where the binding had come loose, Nora had been writing. Small, careful letters, no larger than a fingernail. Dates, names, descriptions. She had documented Solomon's death in precise detail. The Wednesday morning he was taken below, the sounds she had heard through the floor, the Friday silence, the entry in the ledger she had read while dusting the colonel's desk. She had documented 11 other incidents, stretching back to 1848. She was building something that Colonel Aldous Mercer, in all his confidence and cruelty, had never once imagined an enslaved woman could build. Evidence. Meanwhile, the Mercer household was quietly fracturing. Robert Mercer was 23 years old, the colonel's eldest son, and he had just returned from 3 years of study in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a city that could not have been more different from Charleston if it had been built on another planet. Philadelphia in the 1850s was a hotbed of abolitionist activity. The Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society had its offices there. Frederick Douglass had spoken at its lecture halls. The city's free black community was one of the largest and most organized in the entire country, running churches, newspapers, schools, and, though no one advertised this fact openly, a well-established network of safe houses connected to the Underground Railroad, that extraordinary invisible road that carried freedom seekers north from the plantations of the Deep South, through the mid-Atlantic states, all the way to the free soil of New England and Canada. Robert had arrived in Philadelphia as his father's son. He returned to Charleston as something his father would have struggled to name. He moved through the mansion with a new kind of discomfort, flinching at things that had once seemed normal to him, finding himself unable to look at the men and women working on the property with anything other than a shame so acute it felt physical. He had seen the furnace room once, as a boy, and had been told it was for metalwork. Now, watching the patterns of the household, watching who went below and who came back and who didn't, he began to understand what it actually was. He began to find reasons to speak with Nora, not as a master speaks to an enslaved person, not with orders or dismissal, but with questions, small at first, cautious, asking about the history of the property, about the people who worked it. Nora answered carefully, reading him the way she had learned to read everything in that house, slowly, with patience, measuring the distance between what a person said and what they meant. Gradually, she trusted him with more. And then, on a November evening in 1852, with rain hammering the roof and the colonel away in Columbia, South Carolina, attending a legislative session, Nora showed Robert the Bible. He read through the night. Eleanor Mercer, the colonel's wife, a tall, pale woman from the old plantation families of the South Carolina upcountry, who had been raised in the red clay hills outside Greenville and had come to Charleston as a bride at the age of 19, had spent nearly 20 years building an elaborate interior architecture of not knowing. She tended her rose garden. She supervised the kitchen. She corresponded with her sisters in Greenville. She attended Sunday services at St. Michael's Episcopal Church on the corner of Broad and Meeting Streets, one of the oldest churches in the American South, where the sermons spoke of grace and mercy in a building constructed by enslaved labor. She did not go to the basement. She did not ask questions. But the night she found Nora's Bible, tucked between the folds of a freshly ironed tablecloth that Nora had left, perhaps deliberately, perhaps not, on the parlor table, Eleanor Mercer sat alone in the lamplight until the sun came up over the rooftops of Charleston, reading every word in those tiny, careful letters, and something in her, long buried under 20 years of deliberate silence, cracked open. Have you ever heard a family story passed down in whispers? A story about this period of American history that never quite made it into the history books? Subscribe to our channel and help us build this community of memory and truth together. What do you think of the story so far? Do you believe Eleanor Mercer will find the courage to act, or will the weight of the world she was born into be too heavy to lift? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your voice. The spring of 1853 arrived slowly in the South Carolina Low Country. The live oaks put out their new growth in pale silver-green bursts. The marshes filled with the sound of red-winged blackbirds. The sweetgrass along the edges of the Ashley River bent in the warm wind coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, carrying with it the first suggestion of the brutal summer ahead. Charleston, South Carolina went on being Charleston, beautiful, terrible, and utterly convinced of its own permanence. Colonel Aldous Mercer had no reason to believe that the world was about to end. He had no way of knowing that his son Robert had spent the winter making careful, dangerous contact with a network of free black activists and white abolitionist allies operating out of a small bookshop on King Street in downtown Charleston, one of the oldest commercial streets in the American South, where booksellers and dry goods merchants and silversmiths had operated side by side since the colonial era. The network was loosely connected to the broader Underground Railroad infrastructure running north through North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, all the way to the free states of New England. He had no way of knowing that Nora's Bible had been carefully, painstakingly copied, page by page, margin note by margin note, over the course of 3 months. The copies passed hand to hand through the network until they reached a man in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who knew a journalist. The journalist worked for The Liberator, founded in Boston, Massachusetts in 1831 by William Lloyd Garrison. The Liberator was the most widely read abolitionist newspaper in the United States. Its pages had carried the testimonies of Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and dozens of other freedom seekers who had survived the plantations of the Deep South and found their way north to tell the truth about what was happening below the Mason-Dixon line. The paper was despised in South Carolina. Its circulation was technically illegal in the state, but it reached the desks of congressmen in Washington, D.C. It reached the parlors of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. It reached the international press in London and Edinburgh, where British readers, who had abolished slavery across their empire in 1833, followed the American debate with a mixture of horror and fascination. The story of Colonel Aldous Mercer, the furnace room, and the death of a 16-year-old boy named Solomon ran in The Liberator in the early spring of 1853. Within 6 weeks, it had been reprinted in newspapers in New York City, Boston, and Cincinnati, Ohio, that booming Midwestern city on the northern bank of the Ohio River, directly across from the slave state of Kentucky, which had become one of the most important crossing points on the Underground Railroad and a center of fierce public abolitionist organizing. Charleston erupted. The reaction in the city split along lines that had always existed, but rarely been spoken aloud. A portion of the white aristocracy closed ranks around Mercer, dismissing the story as Northern propaganda, abolitionist lies, the latest assault in a cultural war they believed the South was winning. But another portion, merchants with Northern business partners, lawyers with international clients, men whose fortunes depended on trade relationships with cities that were reading these stories over their morning coffee, grew very quiet. The invitations to dinner parties stopped arriving at the Mercer estate. The handshakes at the Charleston Chamber of Commerce became brief and non-committal. A business partner in Savannah, Georgia, a cotton factor who had moved enormous volumes of Mercer's crop through the port of Savannah for 15 years, quietly terminated their arrangement by letter, citing a reorganization of business priorities. Colonel Mercer responded the way men of absolute power always respond when that power begins to slip, with escalation. He tightened the rules on the estate. He increased the surveillance of his enslaved workers. He interrogated, threatened, punished. He was looking for the source of the leak, and the more he looked, the more desperate and erratic he became. He never once looked at Nora. The invisible woman had walked past him every day for 27 years, and he had never once truly seen her. September came to the South Carolina low country like a held breath finally released. The heat broke slightly. The Atlantic began its autumn restlessness, sending long swells up the coast from Florida and the Caribbean. The sky turned the deep theatrical blue of hurricane season, with clouds building on the southern horizon every afternoon. On the night of September 14, 1853, a storm rolled in from the Atlantic. Lightning split the sky over Charleston Harbor. Thunder rattled the windows of the mansions on the Battery. Rain came down in sheets, turning the cobblestone streets into rivers, flooding the low-lying marshlands along the Ashley and Cooper rivers, filling the air with the smell of wet earth and old wood and something electric and unstable. Shortly after midnight, fire broke out in the basement of the Mercer estate. Whether it began by accident, a spark from the furnace on a night when no one was supposed to be below, or by deliberate design, history does not say with certainty. The investigation that followed was conducted by local Charleston authorities who had every reason to reach an uncomplicated conclusion, and they did. What is not disputed: Colonel Aldous Mercer was found in the furnace room at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, badly burned on his hands, his arms, and the left side of his face, lying on the stone floor beside the instrument of his cruelty. The fire had been contained to the basement and the ground floor. The upper stories of the mansion sustained smoke and water damage, but did not collapse. Mercer survived. He was carried out by 2 of his remaining house servants, men who had every reason to leave him there, and chose, for reasons that speak to a depth of humanity that shames every brutality he had inflicted on them, not to. That same night, Robert Mercer helped Nora and 11 other enslaved people leave the estate. They moved through the storm in small groups, following routes that had been memorized over months of quiet planning. Through the marshes along the Ashley River, through the narrow streets of Charleston's free black neighborhoods, where doors opened without a word being spoken, and hands passed them food, dry clothing, and directions. Through the South Carolina Lowcountry in the last hours of darkness, moving north. The network of the Underground Railroad received them at a safe house near Georgetown, South Carolina, 50 miles north of Charleston, on the Waccamaw Neck. That long, thin peninsula between the Waccamaw River and the Atlantic coast, where the rice plantations had been among the most brutal in the entire South. From Georgetown, they moved to Wilmington, North Carolina. From Wilmington north through the pine barrens and the tobacco fields of the North Carolina Piedmont to the Virginia border. From Virginia through the Shenandoah Valley and across the Potomac River into the free state of Maryland. From Maryland into Pennsylvania. They arrived in Philadelphia on an October morning when the maple trees along the Schuylkill River were burning red and gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and autumn leaves, and freedom, for the first time in their lives, felt like something more than a word. Colonel Aldous Mercer was never prosecuted. The law of South Carolina in 1853 would not allow it. The law protected him, as the law had always protected men like him, as the law had been written specifically to protect men like him. The fire was ruled an accident. The estate was partially rebuilt, and for a brief time it appeared that Aldous Mercer might simply weather the storm, as the powerful so often do, bruised, diminished, but intact. But the world was changing beneath his feet, and he was too broken to move with it. His wife, Eleanor, left Charleston in the winter of 1853, returning to her family home in the South Carolina upcountry outside Greenville in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She never returned. She never publicly explained her departure. But she carried Nora's Bible with her, the original, that extraordinary document of courage written in the margins of a King James Bible by a woman who had every reason to stay silent and chose not to. Robert Mercer moved to Philadelphia permanently in early 1854. He spent the rest of his life working with the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Colonel Aldous Mercer died in Columbia, South Carolina in the autumn of 1855, destitute, abandoned by the social world that had once celebrated him, his body still carrying the burn scars from the fire he had built. He was 56 years old. The estate on the western edge of Charleston was sold for debts. The mansion fell into disrepair over the following decades, By the time the Civil War ended in 1865 and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery across the United States, the building had become a shell, its columns cracked, its porches sagging, its basement sealed with brick. The furnace was cold. Nora lived in Philadelphia for the rest of her life. She found work as a seamstress and later as a teacher in one of the city's free black schools. She was present in the city on April 9, 1865, when news of the Confederate surrender reached Philadelphia, and the streets filled with celebration. She lived to see emancipation, she lived to see the world change, and she never stopped writing. Thank you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for staying with this story from beginning to end. You didn't have to, you chose to. And that choice matters more than you know. The best, as we promised, is still ahead, because the stories of the men and women who survived the unsurvivable, who built something out of nothing, who chose courage when the entire world told them to stay silent, those stories are far from over. We are only just beginning to tell them. Our next video is waiting for you. Please, don't miss it. Dashi Sudao. Now before you go, this is a work of fiction inspired by the real and deeply documented history of American slavery, the abolitionist movement, and the Underground Railroad in the antebellum South. The places are real. The history is real. The names and specific events belong to our imagination, but the truth they carry belongs to every person who ever had to fight simply to be recognized as human. We owe them our attention. We owe them our memory. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to this channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it.